happened inside the European Union 60 days ago that most people still don't fully understand. And the reason they don't understand it isn't because it was complicated, it's because the people who should be explaining it have a very strong interest in keeping it quiet. On the 10th of March 2026, Giorgia Meloni walked into the most consequential political standoff in modern European history. And she didn't flinch, she didn't negotiate, she didn't ask for a better deal. She said stop, full stop. And when Brussels looked around expecting to find her isolated, expecting to find her alone on that ledge, they found something that genuinely alarmed them. She had company. This isn't a story about Italy being difficult. It isn't a story about one country trying to protect Russia or undermine Ukraine. This is a story about something much older, much more fundamental, and much more dangerous to the established order of European power. This is a story about who actually controls Europe when the rules stop being convenient. To understand what Meloni just did, you have to understand what she was responding to. And to understand that, you have to go back 4 years, to the freezing cold of February 2022, when Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine and Western governments scrambled to respond. The military response took time, the diplomatic response took months, but the financial response? That happened almost overnight. Within weeks of the invasion, somewhere in the range of 300 billion euros in Russian central bank assets, money that had been sitting inside European financial institutions perfectly legally, was frozen solid, locked, untouchable. The single largest chunk of that, the majority of it, was sitting inside a Belgian financial institution called Euroclear, one of the most important clearinghouses on the planet. At the time, nobody called it a seizure, they called it a freeze, a temporary measure, a pressure tool designed to send a message to Moscow that aggression had a price tag attached. The unspoken assumption, at least the publicly unspoken one, was that this money would sit frozen until some negotiated resolution emerged, and then the question of what happened to it would be dealt with at that point. That assumption did not survive contact with reality as the war stretched from months into years, as Ukraine's reconstruction bill climbed into numbers that made even seasoned economists uncomfortable, and as the political appetite for writing endless blank checks began quietly shrinking in several European capitals. Someone inside the European Commission had an idea, a seductive idea, a clever idea, possibly a catastrophically reckless idea depending on who you ask. What if Europe didn't seize those frozen Russian assets directly? What if instead it borrowed against them? What if those 300 billion euros became collateral, the financial foundation beneath a brand new lending instrument that could unlock up to 210 billion euros in long-term support for Ukraine's defense and reconstruction? On paper, the elegance of this was undeniable. Europe wouldn't be stealing Russian sovereign assets, it would merely be leveraging them. The money technically stays frozen, the legal exposure looks manageable, Ukraine gets funded, Brussels gets to announce a historic package. Everyone goes home satisfied, except for two words that blew the entire construction apart. Article 122. Here is where the story stops being about Ukraine and starts being about something that cuts right to the heart of how Europe governs itself. Under normal European Union rules, a financial operation of this scale, we're talking about 210 billion euros, backed by the sovereign assets of a foreign state, would require every single one of the 27 member governments to say yes. One no is enough to kill it. That's the unanimity requirement, and it exists for a reason. It is the single most important protection that smaller member states have against being steamrolled by the institutional masonry of Brussels. The European Commission looked at that requirement and decided they had found a way around it. Article 122 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union is an emergency clause. It was written for genuine crises, energy shocks, supply chain collapses, the kind of acute economic disruption where waiting for unanimous agreement across 27 governments could mean the difference between managing a crisis and being consumed by one. Under Article 122, the Commission can act on a qualified majority rather than unanimity. The veto effectively disappears. Brussels looked at Ukraine's funding crisis, classified it as an economic emergency under that provision, and prepared to move forward without needing everyone's agreement. The plan was bold, the legal architecture was creative, and then Rome found out about it. Giorgia Meloni's response was not a negotiating position. It was not a list of demands designed to extract concessions before eventually signing on. It was a legal and constitutional objection, stated publicly with precision and with the clear intention of forcing a confrontation rather than avoiding one. Italy's argument was straightforward, devastating, and extremely difficult to refute. Article 122 is an emergency provision. Emergency provisions in European treaty law carry a proportionality requirement, meaning the measure you're invoking emergency powers to implement must actually be proportionate to the emergency you're declaring. The emergency must be real, acute, and genuinely threatening to the economic functioning of the Union. Meloni's government argued that Ukraine's reconstruction funding, however morally urgent, does not meet that threshold. The war in Ukraine is a humanitarian catastrophe and a strategic crisis, but it is not causing the kind of immediate economic collapse inside European member states that Article 122 was designed to address. Using it to bypass unanimity on a €210 billion financial operation involving frozen foreign sovereign assets wasn't emergency governance. It was a power grab wearing the costume of emergency governance. And if it worked, if Brussels successfully used Article 122 this way, and the precedent held, then the unanimity requirement for major financial decisions would effectively be dead. Any future commission wanting to push through a controversial measure could simply declare an emergency, invoke the clause, and proceed. The legal protection that gives smaller member states a seat at the table would have been quietly dismantled, not by changing the treaty, but by reinterpreting it beyond recognition. That argument landed like a detonation inside Brussels. Not because it was inflammatory, because it was correct. Within days of Italy raising its formal objections, the rebellion had spread. Belgium joined, Bulgaria followed, Malta added its name. Suddenly Meloni wasn't a lone dissenter that could be managed or marginalized. She was the visible head of a structured legal and political coalition, and the coalition was growing. What made this particularly alarming for the Commission was the nature of the objections being raised. Belgium's concerns were specific and acute. Euroclear, the institution at the center of this entire operation, sits on Belgian soil. Belgian officials were acutely aware that if this mechanism collapsed legally or triggered an international dispute over sovereign asset protections, Brussels would be holding the bag in ways that extended far beyond political embarrassment. Bulgaria and Malta, smaller nations with far less leverage in European institutional politics, understood that what was being threatened here was the very mechanism that gave them relevance. Take away unanimity, and you take away their ability to say no. And a European Union in which small countries cannot say no is not a union of equals, it is something else entirely. The coalition Meloni assembled was not bound together by sympathy for Moscow. It was bound together by a shared recognition that the method being used to advance this plan was structurally more dangerous than the problem the plan was designed to solve. Inside the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen found herself in a position she had not anticipated. The assumption behind the €210 billion proposal had been that moral weight would carry the day. Support Ukraine, leverage frozen Russian assets, move fast. The politics were supposed to be clean. What she encountered instead was a legally precise, publicly stated, coalition-backed challenge that she could not dismiss as obstruction without appearing to argue that legal constraints don't apply when the Commission decides the stakes are high enough. That is a losing argument in the European Court of Justice. It is an even worse argument in the court of public opinion. There is a second dimension to Italy's opposition that runs even deeper than the Article 122 dispute, and it is a dimension that financial markets around the world have been watching very carefully. Meloni's government raised a question about what using frozen sovereign assets as collateral communicates to every foreign government, every sovereign wealth fund, and every central bank that currently holds assets inside European financial institutions. The question is this: if the European Union can freeze the sovereign assets of one state and then leverage those frozen assets to fund a third party, what does that tell you about the security of your own assets held in Europe? The answer is uncomfortable and unavoidable. It tells you that assets in European institutions are protected by law right up until the moment a political majority decides otherwise. And once that perception crystallizes in global financial markets, it does not dissolve easily. Capital is not sentimental. Capital goes where it feels safe. And a jurisdiction that has demonstrated it will reshape the rules around sovereign assets when under political pressure is a jurisdiction that serious international investors will quietly begin treating with new caution. This is not a theoretical risk. It is a concern already being discussed privately in financial centers from the Gulf to East Asia. Meloni's government put it on the record. Brussels has not produced a clean answer to it. What the Commission has produced is political pressure, moral urgency, and the institutional weight of the EU bureaucracy. Against that, Meloni deployed legal precision, a public coalition, and a framing of her opposition so carefully constructed that attacking it requires arguing against rule of law inside a rules-based institution. That is not a fight von der Leyen can win cleanly. The confrontation has now arrived at a point where neither side can retreat without consequence. Von der Leyen's teams are reportedly exploring alternative legal frameworks, ways to achieve the same financial outcome without relying solely on Article 122, reducing the proportionality vulnerability that Italy has identified. Other options involve offering dissenting governments policy concessions in unrelated areas in exchange for dropping formal legal opposition. This is the standard Brussels playbook. Find the price, pay it, move forward. The problem is that Meloni has not priced her objection. She has framed it as a matter of constitutional principle, argued publicly before the entire European legal community. You cannot buy off a constitutional principle with a road infrastructure package. The moment you try, you confirm that the opposition was legitimate and that Brussels was in the wrong. Meanwhile, Ukraine's needs are real and they are not pausing for European institutional disputes. Every week this confrontation continues is a week of resource gaps with direct consequences. The Commission is attempting to deploy that reality as moral leverage against Meloni, to argue that her legal precision is translating into human cost on the ground. It is a powerful emotional argument. It is also a structurally terrifying precedent, because if moral urgency is accepted as sufficient justification for bypassing legal constraints inside the European Union, that logic does not expire when the cause is universally admired. That logic sits in the treaty, available for use the next time a political majority decides the moment is urgent enough. Meloni is not simply protecting Italy's veto, she is protecting the principle that European institutions are bound by the same legal architecture they were built on, regardless of how urgent the political moment feels. That principle is either absolute or it is nothing, and an institution that has violated it once, even for defensible reasons, carries that violation into every future decision it makes. What Europe is facing right now is not a funding dispute. It is not a clash of personalities between Rome and Brussels. It is a fundamental question about the nature of the institution itself. Is the European Union a union of member states bound by shared law, where every government retains protected legal standing regardless of size or political alignment? Or is it a structure where emergency powers expand to fill whatever space political will requires, where legal constraints soften when the institutional center decides the stakes justify it? The governments of Belgium, Bulgaria, and Malta standing beside Meloni already know their answer. They are the smaller players. The unanimity requirement is not an administrative inconvenience for them, it is the mechanism that makes their participation meaningful. Remove it and you have not reformed European governance. You have quietly converted it into something that smaller member states never agreed to join. The confrontation that Meloni launched on the 10th of March 2026 is not resolved. The deadline is approaching. The legal teams are working. The coalition is holding. And inside the corridors of Brussels, the question that nobody is saying out loud but everybody is thinking is the one that matters most right now. If this plan cannot pass with the legal mechanism the Commission chose, and if the alternative mechanisms are too slow or too legally exposed, what happens to 300 billion euros in frozen Russian assets that can't be used, can't be returned, and are sitting at the center of a legal battle that could run for years? That question does not have a comfortable answer, and the answer Europe gives or fails to give in the weeks ahead will not just determine the fate of one funding package, it will define what kind of institution the European Union is prepared to be for the next generation. Meloni started something on that March morning that cannot be unstarted. The crack is visible now, and cracks once opened in institutional foundations do not close on their own. The story continues. Stay with us.